Lawyer can't win the case until his intern arrives and reveals a new witness. Michael Thompson held his head in his hands as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict in the most important case of his career. For months, he had fought to prove the rights of the elderly man sitting beside him in a dispute that could leave his Frank homeless at 68 years old. That's when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. Jessica Miller, his 26-year-old intern, rushed into the room with an expression he had never seen before. She leaned in and whispered something in his ear that made Michael's heart race. "Doctor, I found Mrs. Margaret. She's here and wants to talk." Michael looked at Jessica, confused. Margaret was a name that appeared in some old documents, but everyone thought she had moved south years ago when Johnson's bakery closed. "What do you mean she's here?" Michael whispered. "She never left town. She's been living with her daughter in Oakwood. And, doctor, she knows everything." The lawyer felt a chill in his stomach. The case had seemed lost from the start. His Frank was being sued by his own nephews who wanted to take the house he had lived in for 40 years. They claimed their uncle wasn't mentally fit to manage his own affairs and that the house should be sold to pay for a nursing home. Michael had known Frank since childhood. The old man had been his parents' neighbor and had always been sharp and hard-working. When the nephews filed the lawsuit, Michael didn't hesitate to take the case, even though he knew the family could afford the best lawyers in the area. The first hearing had been a disaster. The nephew's lawyer, Mr. Robert Anderson, presented questionable medical reports and testimonies from neighbors who barely knew Frank. Michael tried to counter, but his evidence seemed weak compared to his opponent's arguments. "Your Honor," Mr. Anderson had said in that first hearing, "Mr. Frank Wilson has shown clear signs of mental confusion. He forgets to pay bills, talks to himself, and has been seen walking outside in his pajamas in the middle of the night." Michael tried to defend his client, but Frank seemed too nervous to speak. The old man stuttered and lost his train of thought, which only made things worse. Michael left that hearing feeling like he had failed the man who trusted him. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Jessica had joined the office 3 months earlier, fresh out of law school in the neighboring town. She was a determined young woman, the daughter of a retired teacher and a construction worker who had worked hard to pay for her education. Michael had hired her more out of compassion than necessity, as the firm was struggling financially. But the young woman quickly proved she had much more to offer than he expected. While Michael was drowning in doubts about Frank's case, Jessica spent nights in the office, reviewing every document, every piece of evidence, searching for something everyone else had overlooked. It was during one of those nights that she found a clue. Among the old papers from Frank's house, there was a purchase agreement dated 1985. Margaret Johnson's name appeared as a witness to the transaction, but there was something else. A handwritten note in the margin mentioning a verbal agreement about property improvements. "Dr. Thompson," Jessica said the next morning, "we need to find this Margaret. She might know things no one else does." Michael was skeptical. How could a witness from nearly 40 years ago help? But Jessica insisted. She began searching for Margaret Johnson all over town, visiting record offices, talking to old neighbors, following leads that seemed to go nowhere. The second hearing was approaching, and Michael still had nothing new to present. Old Frank had worsened after the first defeat. The elderly man barely left the house and had sunk into a deep sadness that worried Michael. Mrs. Ruth, the neighbor who cared for him, called almost every day to report that Frank hardly ate and spent hours staring out the window. "Doctor, he sits there in the rocking chair that belonged to his late wife, looking at the backyard as if he's saying goodbye," Mrs. Ruth said, her voice trembling. It was around this time that Michael began wondering if he should advise Frank to accept a settlement. Maybe it would be better to ensure the old man had some money to live modestly rather than risk losing everything. But Jessica wouldn't give up. She discovered that the Johnson family had owned a bakery downtown for over 20 years. The bakery closed when the family patriarch passed away, but some neighbors remembered Margaret and her daughter. "Margaret really changed," said Mr. Walter, who owned the barber shop next to where the bakery used to be. "But I think her daughter still lives here. She married a man from the Oakwood neighborhood. Jessica's heart raced. Oakwood was an old part of town where many traditional families still lived. She spent the weekend walking its streets, talking to residents, until she finally found Helen Johnson Smith. "My mother has lived with me for 5 years," Helen confirmed. "She's 71 and in good health, thank God." When Jessica explained the reason for her visit, Helen called her mother. Margaret appeared in the living room, a woman with completely white hair but bright eyes and a sharp mind. "Frank Wilson. Of course I remember him," Margaret exclaimed. "A good, hard-working man. He bought that house from Henry in the 80s. Do you remember any details about the purchase?" Jessica asked, trying to contain her excitement. Margaret smiled and went to an old cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a shoebox full of yellowed papers. "I've always kept everything. My husband used to say it was a habit, but you can't throw away important things." Margaret sifted through the papers until she found a brown envelope. Inside was a copy of Frank's house deed and something that made Jessica hold her breath: a handwritten receipt signed by Frank's nephews. "They came here in 1987, Margaret explained. "They wanted me to sign papers saying their uncle wasn't fit to take care of the house. They offered money. I didn't sign, but they left this paper here, thinking I'd change my mind." Jessica read the document with wide eyes. It was a clear confession that the nephews had planned to take Frank's house from him over 30 years ago. The paper also mentioned that they knew he had invested his savings into improving the property, which greatly increased its value. "Margaret, you kept this all these years?" Jessica asked. "I kept it because I knew it would be needed someday. Those boys were always greedy. Frank raised them after their parents died in an accident, gave them everything. And instead of being grateful, they were angry because he wouldn't let them live in the house after they got married." Jessica felt tears in her eyes. The story Margaret told completely changed the case's perspective. This wasn't about a senile uncle who needed care. It was about a generous man being betrayed by the people he'd raised as his own. But Margaret had more to say. She revealed that over the years, the nephews had tried to convince others to sign false documents. There was also the matter of the home improvements. Frank had spent all his savings to build an adapted bathroom for his wife, who had fallen ill in her final years. He even sold the motorcycle he loved so much to make those renovations, Margaret recounted. All so Dorothy could have comfort in her last months. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. When Jessica returned to the office on Monday morning, Michael could hardly believe what he heard. The evidence she had found not only defended Frank, but also revealed the true nature of his nephews. "Jessica, this changes everything," Michael exclaimed. "But would Margaret agree to testify?" "She already said yes, Doctor. In fact, she said she'd been waiting years for this opportunity." Michael felt a mix of hope and nervousness. This case had become personal for him. It wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about bringing justice to a man who had dedicated his life to caring for people who now betrayed him. The second hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Michael spent the days before preparing his strategy. He knew Dr. Robert wouldn't expect this turn of events and was confident he could secure an easy victory. On the morning of the hearing, Michael arrived at the courthouse with a confidence he hadn't felt in months. Jessica was by his side, carrying a folder with all the new evidence. Frank seemed more upbeat, as if sensing something had changed. "Dr. Michael," the elderly man said as they climbed the courthouse steps, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you're doing for me." "Frank, you don't need to thank us. It's our duty to seek justice." The hearing began with Dr. Robert presenting his final arguments. He was confident, almost arrogant, repeating the same points about Frank's alleged mental incapacity. "Your Honor," Dr. Robert said, "the facts are clear. The respondent is unfit to manage his affairs and needs the protection of his family." Michael waited patiently for his turn. When he stood to speak, there was a calm in his voice that even surprised Jessica. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness who can fully clarify this case." Dr. Robert turned, startled. There had been no new witness on the list he'd received. "Margaret Johnson," Michael announced. An elderly woman who has known this family's entire history for 40 years. Margaret entered the courtroom, leaning on a cane but with a straight posture and a clear mind. She looked at Frank and smiled, a smile that conveyed decades of friendship and mutual respect. Margaret's testimony was devastating to the nephew's defense. She spoke of the bribery attempt, presented the documents she had kept, and revealed the family's true story. "Doctor," Margaret said, addressing the judge, "I saw that man cry when he lost his wife. I saw him sell everything he had to give her comfort. I saw him work twice as hard to support his nephews when they were orphaned, and now I see those same nephews trying to steal what little remains from a lifetime of honest work." Doctor. Robert tried to challenge her testimony, but the evidence was irrefutable. The documents Margaret presented clearly showed the nephews had planned this scheme decades ago. "And there's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling another paper from her bag. "They came to me again last week, offering $5,000 to keep me from appearing here today." The revelation caused an uproar in the courtroom. Dr. Robert paled and tried to protest, but Margaret had recorded the conversation on her daughter's phone. The judge called for a recess to review all the evidence. During the break, Michael observed his Uncle Frank's nephews. Thomas and Richard, middle-aged men who had grown up under their uncle's care, now couldn't bring themselves to look his way. Frank approached Michael and Jessica. "How did you manage to find Margaret?" the elderly man asked, tears in his eyes. "That was Dr. Jessica's doing," Michael replied. "She didn't give up when I had already lost hope." Jessica took Frank's hand. "You deserve justice, and justice is what we're going to get." When the hearing resumed, the mood had completely shifted. The judge, an experienced man around 55 years old, had carefully reviewed all the evidence and documents presented by Margaret. After thorough examination of the submitted documents, the judge declared, "It is evident that not only does the respondent possess full mental capacity, but he was also the victim of an attempt to defraud his property rights." Dr. Roberts still tried one last appeal, questioning the validity of the old documents, but the judge was firm. The documents presented by Mrs. Margaret Johnson are authentic and contemporaneous to the events described. Furthermore, the recent bribery attempt proven by the recording demonstrates the bad faith of the petitioners. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. Jessica squeezed his hand under the table, both moved by the victory. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I rule the petition for guardianship unfounded and order that Mr. Frank Wilson retain full rights over his assets. Additionally, I order the petitioners to cover all legal fees and attorney costs." Frank began to cry, but they were tears of happiness. Margaret rose from her seat and walked over to him, giving him a hug that symbolized decades of true friendship. The nephews left the room with their heads down, accompanied by Dr. Robert. Michael watched them go, feeling a mix of victory and sadness for a family torn apart by greed. "Dr. Michael," Margaret said, approaching him after the hearing, "thank you for giving voice to the truth. I've wanted to tell this story for years." "Margaret, you're the one who saved this case. Without your courage, Frank could have lost everything." Jessica was radiant. This had been her first major victory as a lawyer, and she had been instrumental in the outcome. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. In the days following the court victory, Michael reflected deeply on what he had learned from the case. Jessica had shown a dedication and intuition he hadn't seen in the legal field for years. The young woman had gone beyond her duties, investing personal time and energy to uncover the truth. "Jessica," Michael said one morning as they organized the case files, "I'd like to make you an offer." The young woman looked at him curiously. "I'd like you to become my partner. I know you're newly graduated, but you have something many experienced lawyers have lost: a passion for justice." Jessica was speechless. Becoming a partner at a law firm so early in her career was a dream she hadn't even imagined possible. "Doctor, I don't know what to say. It's such an honor." "You deserve it, Jessica. This case showed you have the heart and skill to be a great lawyer." Meanwhile, Frank was adjusting to his new reality. The court victory had restored not just his home, but also his dignity and self-respect. Mrs. Ruth shared that he had started tending to his garden again and even began receiving visits from other neighbors. But the story wasn't over. A few days after the hearing, Thomas, one of Frank's nephews, showed up at Michael's office. "Doctor, I'd like to speak with you about my uncle," said Thomas, visibly embarrassed. Michael received him with some suspicion. After all, this was the man who had tried to steal the house of the very uncle who raised him. "Doctor, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'd like to apologize to my uncle. My brother and I were blinded by greed. The lawyer we hired convinced us we were doing what was best for him." Michael studied Thomas's face. There was genuine remorse in his eyes. "Thomas, I can talk to your Uncle Frank, but I can't guarantee he'll want to see you. The hurt runs very deep." "I understand, Doctor. I just want him to know we recognize our mistake." Michael spoke with Frank about Thomas's request. The elderly man remained silent for a long time before answering. "Doctor, they're the only children I ever had. Their parents passed when they were young and I raised them as my own. I can't say I forgive easily, but I also can't carry this bitterness forever." Michael was moved by Frank's generosity. Even after all he'd been through, the old man still found compassion in his heart. The meeting between Frank and his nephews was set for the following Sunday at the house that had nearly been lost. Margaret was also present, serving as a mediator between the generations. "Uncle," Thomas said, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry for everything we did. There's no excuse for our actions." Richard, the other nephew, was also visibly remorseful. "Uncle, you gave us everything when we were young, a home, an education, love, and we repaid you by trying to take the only thing you had left." Frank listened in silence, seated in the same rocking chair where he'd endured so many difficult moments in recent weeks. "Boys," he finally said, "you hurt me deeply. I can't pretend otherwise, but I also can't forget that you're my family." Margaret watched the scene with tears in her eyes. She had seen this family grow and change over the decades, and now she witnessed a reconciliation that had seemed impossible just weeks before. "There's one condition," Frank continued. "I want you to learn the value of what truly matters. Money and property come and go, but family and dignity last forever." The nephews agreed, promising to work to regain their uncle's trust. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Richard began visiting Frank regularly. They helped with small repairs around the house, ran errands for him, and gradually rebuilt the family bonds that had been broken by greed. Michael watched this transformation with admiration. The case had become much more than a legal victory. It had turned into a lesson about forgiveness, family, and second chances. Jessica, too, was learning valuable lessons. Her experience with Frank's case had shown her that law wasn't just about rules and regulations, but about understanding people and fighting for human justice. "Dr. Michael," she said during a conversation at the office, "this case changed how I see our profession. It's not just about winning or losing, it's about making a difference in people's lives." "Exactly, Jessica. That's why I've decided to take on more cases like this, people who need justice but can't afford it." The office began receiving more clients in need. Word of Frank's victory had spread through town, and many who felt wronged sought out Michael and Jessica for help. There was Gladys, a 72-year-old widow, whose children were pressuring her to sell her home to pay debts she hadn't incurred. There was also George, a retiree who was being scammed by a health insurance company. Each case brought its own complexities, but Michael and Jessica faced them all with the same dedication they had shown in Frank's case. Margaret had become a sort of informal consultant for the office. Her life experience and her memory for old details often provided valuable clues for cases involving family disputes or historical property issues. "Margaret," Michael said during one of her visits to the office, "have you ever thought about writing your memoirs? Your story could help others." Margaret laughed. "Doctor, my memories are all right here," she said, pointing to a new shoebox she always carried. "And now I know they can do some good in the world." The firm's success also caught the attention of other lawyers. Dr. Robert, the attorney who had lost Frank's case, even sought Michael out for a conversation. "Michael," Robert said during a chance encounter at the courthouse, "I have to admit, I underestimated you and your team. That case was a lesson in humility for me." Robert, we all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them. You're right. Maybe I was so focused on winning that I forgot what really matters: justice. This conversation marked the beginning of a shift in Dr. Roberts' approach. He became more careful in selecting his cases and more ethical in his practices. 6 months after the courtroom victory, Frank threw a party at his home to celebrate not just the legal win, but also his family's reconciliation. Michael, Jessica, and Margaret were there, along with Thomas, Richard, and their families. "I'd like to make a toast," Frank said, raising a glass of grape juice, "to justice, to family, and to the people who never give up doing what's right." Everyone raised their glasses, moved by the elderly man's words. "Dr. Michael and Dr. Jessica," Frank continued, "you didn't just save my home, you saved my dignity and my family." Michael looked around the room, seeing smiling faces where there had once been only sadness and conflict. That moment confirmed for him that he had chosen the right path by taking on cases like this. "Frank," Michael replied, "truthfully, you're the one who taught us the real value of practicing law. You showed us that our profession can be an instrument of healing and reconciliation." Jessica was also emotional. This had been her first major experience as a lawyer, and it had resulted not just in a professional victory, but in personal growth. "I especially want to thank Margaret," Jessica said. "Your courage to speak the truth after so many years is what made all of this possible." Margaret smiled, holding Frank's hand. "My dear, sometimes we keep secrets for so long that we forget they can be the key to justice. You reminded me of that." The party went on into the afternoon, filled with conversation, laughter, and a sense of peace that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Thomas and Richard helped serve the guests, showing a humility and affection for their uncle that had been lost for years. During the celebration, Richard approached Michael. "Doctor, I'd like to ask a favor. My brother and I want to do something to make up for what we did to our uncle. We're thinking of setting up a fund to help other seniors who might be going through similar situations." Michael was surprised and impressed by the idea. "Richard, that's a wonderful idea. You want to turn a negative experience into something positive for others." "Exactly. We don't want other seniors to go through what our uncle did." Michael discussed the proposal with Jessica, and together they decided to help the brothers structure the project. They created a small foundation that offered free legal assistance to elderly people in vulnerable situations. The foundation started small, operating in a room provided by a local church. Margaret volunteered, using her life experience to guide seniors seeking help. The first case handled by the foundation was Mrs. Edith, a 75-year-old woman who was being deceived by fake bank representatives. Margaret immediately recognized the signs of fraud and advised Mrs. Edith to seek out Michael and Jessica. "Margaret," Mrs. Edith said after resolving her issue, "thank you for warning me about those men. I almost lost all my savings." "Mrs. Edith, we seniors need to protect each other. The experience we have is worth more than any diploma." The foundation grew quickly. Soon they were handling cases across the region, always with the legal support of Michael and Jessica. Frank also got involved in the project, offering his home for meetings and awareness events. The elderly man had found a new purpose in life, using his experience to help others in similar situations. "Dr. Michael," Frank said during one of these meetings, "I never thought something so bad could turn into something so good." "Frank, that happens when good people decide to make a difference. You and your family turned pain into purpose." The foundation story reached the local newspapers. A reporter from the town's radio station did a special feature on the project, interviewing Michael, Jessica, Margaret, and Frank. "How did the idea for this foundation come about?" the reporter asked. "It came from necessity," Jessica replied. "We realized many seniors go through situations like Frank's, but not everyone has someone to fight for them." "And what sets your work apart?" the reporter continued. "Our difference is human experiences," Margaret answered. "It's not just legal knowledge, but understanding the difficulties that come with age and respect for the wisdom of years lived." The radio feature had a big impact. People from other towns began reaching out to the foundation, and young lawyers volunteered their services. Michael decided to expand the project, creating a network of volunteer lawyers across several cities in the region. Each participating firm committed to dedicating a few hours a week to cases involving vulnerable seniors. "Jessica," Michael said during a meeting to plan the expansion, "do you realize what we've started here? A movement that could change thousands of lives." "Doctor, when I first started working here, I never imagined a single case could have such big consequences. Now I see that every victory can be the start of something much greater." The network grew to over 50 volunteer lawyers in 15 cities. They handled cases of all complexities, from simple scams to complex family disputes like Frank's. Margaret had become a kind of ambassador for the project. She visited nursing homes, community centers, and churches, talking to seniors about their rights and how to protect themselves from abuse. "My friends," Margaret would say in her talks, "age brings us experience, but it can also make us easy targets for ill-intentioned people. We need to come together to protect ourselves and each other." Margaret's talks were always packed. The seniors related to her and trusted her advice. Many discovered they were victims of situations they thought were normal. 2 years after winning Frank's case, the foundation had become a national reference in senior care. Michael and Jessica were invited to speak at universities and legal conferences about the work they were doing. "Our experience has shown that law can be much more than a profession," said Michael during a lecture in the state capitol. "It can be an instrument of social change. And it also showed that life experience is a form of knowledge as valuable as any degree," added Jessica. Frank, now 70, had become a respected figure in the community. He chaired the city's senior council and was regularly consulted on matters related to elderly rights. Thomas and Richard had fully reconciled with their uncle and now worked actively in the foundation. Thomas handled administrative duties, while Richard had decided to study law to assist more directly with cases. "Uncle," Thomas said during a family gathering, "I want you to know that the mistake we made was the best thing that ever happened to us. It taught us the value of family and honesty." Frank smiled, looking at the nephews he had raised, now men of integrity. "Boys, we all make mistakes in life. What matters is having the courage to admit them and work to make things right." Margaret, at 73, remained active and determined. She had written a book about her experiences, titled "Keeping Memories, Making Justice." The book became a local success, and all proceeds went to the foundation. "Margaret," Jessica said during the book launch, "you're an example to us all. You show it's never too late to make a difference in the world. My dear, life has taught me that every experience, good or bad, can be turned into something useful. You just need the courage to share and the wisdom to learn." The book launch was held at Frank's house, the very place where it had all begun. The home that was nearly lost now hosted celebrations of victories that benefited hundreds. During the event, Michael reflected on the journey they had taken since that day in court, when Jessica rushed in with news about Margaret. "Who would have thought a case that seemed hopeless would turn into all this?" Michael said to Jessica. "Doctor, I think sometimes the greatest victories come from moments when we believe all is lost. That's when we discover our true strength." Michael and Jessica's firm had become one of the most respected in the region, not for the money they made, but for the social impact they created. They maintained a policy of handling at least 30% of their cases pro bono, always prioritizing seniors and vulnerable individuals. Frank's story had become legendary in town. Many shared it with their children and grandchildren, using it as proof that justice, even when it seems impossible, always finds a way. "Dad," Margaret's daughter said during a visit, "Frank's story should be a movie. It's a story of hope for so many." "Sweetheart," Margaret replied, "it doesn't need to be a movie, it needs to be an example, and that's already happened." Indeed, the story had inspired similar movements across the country. Young lawyers sought Michael and Jessica's guidance on creating similar projects in their cities. The case's impact had also changed the town's relationship with its elderly. New protection programs, awareness campaigns, and a senior care center were established. Frank was invited to be the center's patron, an honor that moved him deeply. "Dr. Michael," Frank said during the center's inauguration, "when those boys tried to take my house, I thought my life was over. Now I see it was just beginning a new chapter. Frank, you've taught us all that age brings wisdom, not weakness, and that with the right people by our side, we can overcome any challenge. The ceremony was attended by local authorities, representatives from other foundations, and dozens of seniors who had benefited from the project. It was a moment of celebration, but also of reflection on everything that had been achieved. Margaret was honored as the Memory Guardian, a title created especially to recognize her contribution to justice and the community. "Margaret," said the mayor during the tribute, "you've taught us that memory is a form of resistance and that preserving the truth is an act of courage." Margaret, moved, thanked the honor. "Mr. Mayor, I only did what anyone should do. I spoke the truth when it was needed. I hope this inspires others to do the same." After the ceremony, there was a gathering at Frank's house. The same house that had nearly been lost now welcomed authorities and celebrated victories that benefited the entire community. Thomas and Richard served the guests with pride, showing how much they had transformed over the years. They were no longer the greedy men who had tried to steal their uncle's home, but individuals committed to social justice. "Dr. Michael," Richard said during the party, "I want you to know this project didn't just save our uncle, it saved us too. It gave us a chance to redeem ourselves and do something good with our lives. Richard, everyone deserves a second chance. You made the most of yours and turned it into something beautiful." The party lasted well into the night, filled with conversation, music, and deep emotion. It was the celebration of a victory that had gone beyond a legal case and become a movement for social change. Jessica, now a respected lawyer and partner at a thriving firm, watched it all with a profound sense of fulfillment. She had found her professional and personal purpose in this work. "Dr. Michael," Jessica said as they observed the festivities, "thank you for believing in me when I was just an inexperienced intern." "Jessica, I should be the one thanking you. You taught me that law can be so much more than I ever imagined. You brought passion and purpose to our work." As the party continued, Michael reflected on everything he had learned over those years. Frank's case hadn't just changed the elderly man's life, it had changed the lives of everyone involved. He had discovered that true law wasn't just in courtrooms or legal codes, but in human connections, in the ability to listen, understand, and fight for what is right. Margaret, sitting in the rocking chair that had belonged to Frank's late wife, watched the celebration with satisfaction. She had lived to see justice triumph, and to know that her courage in preserving the truth for so many years had been worth it. "Margaret," Frank said as he approached her, "thank you for keeping those papers all these years. Thank you for speaking the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent." "Frank," Margaret replied, "true friendship means being there in the hard times and fighting for what's right, no matter how long it takes." They embraced, two seniors who had lived through decades of life and were now celebrating not just a personal victory, but the legacy they would leave for future generations. Frank's story had become more than a legal case. It had become a symbol that age brings wisdom, that family can be rebuilt, that justice always finds a way, and that one determined person can make all the difference in the world. When the party ended and the guests had left, Frank stood alone in his house, the same house he had nearly lost, now a symbol of victory and reconciliation. He sat in the rocking chair and looked out at the backyard where he had spent so many difficult moments. Now, that space was filled with plants that Thomas and Richard had helped plant, symbolizing his family's rebirth. "Dorothy," said Frank, speaking to his late wife, "you'd be proud to see how our family has come together again, and you'd be proud to know our story is helping others." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, as if nature itself was responding to the old man's words. Frank smiled and closed his eyes, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. The next morning, Michael arrived at the office to find a letter on his desk. It was from a lawyer in another state, explaining how she had started a project similar to theirs in her city, inspired by Frank's story. "Jessica," Michael called, "come see this. Our story is inspiring people across the country." Jessica read the letter and smiled. "Doctor, I think this is just the beginning. Frank's story shows that an injustice can become the starting point for changing the world." End of story. Tell us what you thought of this touching story. Do you believe Michael and Jessica made the right decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories.